Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington with breaking news and new developments in the White House's legal fight over its sweeping tariff agenda. Moments ago, a federal appeals court gave the administration the emergency relief it was looking for, temporarily pausing a ruling that was handed down last night by a federal trade court, which said that most of the president's tariffs on U.S. trading partners were unconstitutional, and giving the White House just 10 days to unwind them all. The ruling this afternoon from the appeals court effectively reinstates those tariffs for now. Here was White House trade advisor Peter Navarro just moments after that appeals court decision.
The tariffs remain in place. The court told us, they didn't all but tell us, they told us, go do it another way. So you can assume that even if we lose, we will do it another way. And I can assure the American people that the Trump tariff agenda is alive, well, healthy, and will be implemented to protect you, to save your jobs and your factories, and to stop shipping foreign wealth, our wealth, into foreign hands.
So you are working on a plan B
right now? Of course. There's no plan B. It's plan A.
Now, it comes after the White House earlier today lashed out at the judicial branch over a series of rulings against its tariff authority, with Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt maligning the courts and trying to undermine their legitimacy as a check on the president's power.
3 judges of the U.S. Court of International Trade disagreed and brazenly abused their judicial power to usurp the authority of President Trump to stop him from carrying out the mandate that the American people gave him. The courts should have no role here. There is a troubling and dangerous trend of unelected judges inserting themselves into the presidential decision-making process. America cannot function if President Trump, or any other president for that matter, has their sensitive diplomatic or trade negotiations railroaded by activist judges.
Now, much of that ire from the White House was directed at the federal trade court for last night's ruling from a 3-judge panel that the president exceeded his authority and unconstitutionally bypassed Congress when he put in place those so-called Liberation Day tariffs last month and the fentanyl tariffs that he imposed on China. The administration then threatened to take the issue all the way to the Supreme Court if it didn't get immediate relief, arguing that allowing the ruling to stand would cause immediate, irreparable harm to the nation. Amid all this back and forth with the courts and the overall trade policy confusion on Wall Street, stocks ended the day slightly up. It comes amid another major development today that the president summoned Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell to an in-person meeting at the White House today, urging Powell to lower interest rates. The meeting prompting the Federal Reserve to put out a statement assuring the public that Chairman Powell told the president he would not bend to political pressure from the White House. I'm joined now by NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Cheung, and Tim Brightbill, an attorney who specializes in international trade law and policy. Thanks to all of you for starting us off. Gabe, it's another day of breakneck developments from the courts to the stock market and Washington and beyond. We played a little bit of Peter Navarro's reaction, of course, to this latest court ruling on the Trump tariffs. But what else are your sources telling you from inside the administration about the tariff policy?
Kristen, as you described it, certainly tariff whiplash here. For the past hour or so, we've been trying to get reaction from the administration. You just heard there from Peter Navarro. And look, this is the White House is moving full speed ahead with these tariffs, and they view this temporary stay as another step in the process. Caroline Leavitt earlier today, suggesting that this fight could go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. So this is another step in the process. We just got a statement from the plaintiff's attorney in this case, stressing that this is just a temporary stay. But Peter Navarro was asked about what should small businesses take from this, all this uncertainty, all this back and forth. And he basically stressed that this is worth the pain, that the uncertainty is worth it to realign global trade. But certainly a lot of whiplash once again here at the White House. And, it's only 4 o'clock, Kristen.
It's a good point, Gabe. The administration, of course, has been in the middle of trade talks with several countries. Peter Navarro had said 90 deals in 90 days. What's the status of those negotiations? And Gabe, could this in fact limit the White House's leverage in those negotiations?
Well, some analysts are saying that, but I put that question specifically to Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, earlier today in the White House briefing, and she said no, that these that all of this, that the ruling yesterday would not affect trade negotiations because the administration feels that it will win. And they are stressing that, they think that the countries around the world see that, of course. Critics of the administration are skeptical of that. And by the way, Kristen, one thing I didn't mention, you spoke about earlier about how the White House was calling this three-judge panel rogue judges. Well, President Trump, during his first term, appointed one of those judges, and there was another of the three appointed by President Reagan, Kristen.
Yeah, a really important point to point out there. Gabe, let me ask you about another major development at the White House today. We learned that President Trump met with Fed Chair Jerome Powell. We know for months now the president has been urging the Fed chair to lower interest rates, something that he has not done in the wake of these tariffs going into effect. What exactly is the White House saying about that meeting? And what are we hearing from the Fed chair himself, Gabe?
Well, Kristen, the president has been kind of backing off a little bit his threat to fire Jerome Powell, essentially saying he'll just wait till his term expires next year. But he has been railing on the Fed chairman for not lowering interest rates. And you read part of his statement a little earlier. I found it interesting that in that statement from the Federal Reserve, it mentioned that Chair Powell did not discuss his expectations for monetary policy with the president today here at the White House. Carolyn Levitt, though, was asked about her readout and the administration's readout of the meeting. Listen to that.
I can share with you that we saw, the president and I both saw the statement that the Fed put out after the meeting. That statement is correct. However, the president did say that he believes the Fed chair is making a mistake by not lowering interest rates, which is putting us at an economic disadvantage to China and other countries. And the president's been very vocal about that, both publicly and now I can reveal privately as well.
Kristen, what stuck out to me about that soundbite is, notice she said that the Fed chairman's statement was correct. However, basically, getting it in there that they have sharp disagreements even still after this meeting. Kristen.
Yeah, and as she said, that those disagreements have not exactly been a secret. Gabe Gutierrez, as always, thank you for your great reporting from the White House. Brian, let me head over to you. Let's look at and talk about the market reactions. They actually ended the day a bit up in the wake of all of this tariff whiplash at the courts. What do you make of that?
Yeah, if you look at the Dow action today, it wasn't anything particularly remarkable, even though the headline was a bit splashy that there would be this potential stay of these worldwide tariffs at 10%. You can see that the Dow Jones only ended the day about 0.3 positive. And obviously, there have been a number of earnings as well throughout the last few days. So it is indeed the case that, this is not, I would describe a remarkably positive day that's kind of hinged to specifically this development. And I think that's because markets are kind of shrugging off the implications of all of this, because some of the commentary is that, first off, obviously there's a legal challenge. This appeals development in just the last hour underscores how it's really far from a set done deal that these tariffs will be canceled by the legal system here in the United States. But also, even if they are, the Trump administration could just use other types of avenues, like, for example, Section 232 tariffs on specific industries to get around the current way of getting these tariffs done, but still imposing these added costs on imports coming in from other countries. So I think that's one big reason why we didn't see the stock market react more strongly to the news overnight.
Brian, one of the big words as we've watched this tariff policy unfold has been uncertainty. The uncertainty that businesses, large and small, have been dealing with, the uncertainty that Wall Street has been dealing with. Is there any more clarity after this back and forth in the courts?
Well, I don't think so. And especially if you're a small business, which, by the way, I want to point out that the legal challenge to the Trump administration's 10% blanket tariffs that were originally struck down by this court came from 5 small businesses. One of them is a New York-based wine importer. Another one is a Virginia-based electronics toy maker. So it's small businesses that are trying to figure out how to handle these tariffs. And even in just the last 18 to 19 hours, if I'm doing my math right, I think 8 p.m. yesterday Eastern time was around when we found out about this court ruling. You thought that maybe these 10% tariffs weren't around, and then here we are in the afternoon, less than 24 hours after that, saying, oh, well, the tariffs are back on the table. If you're a small business, how do you plan around that? And I've talked to many small businesses over the last few months that have said, we're okay with the idea of tariffs. In fact, we even agree in some cases with the reasons for why President Trump is doing this, but we would really prefer that he say it's going to be 10% for this year, 10% for the year after, another 10% for the year after, because at this current strategy where you don't know in any given hour what the tariff rates are going to be. You just can't plan for that. That's not good for business, Kristen.
Yeah, it certainly does make it incredibly challenging from that perspective. And I want to ask you about something that I was just talking to Gabe about, which is these negotiations that are underway. The White House saying serious talks with at least 18 countries. Peter Navarro had said 90 deals in 90 days. To what extent does this limit the White House's leverage in these negotiations?
Yeah, well, I mean, it does certainly take away some of the leverage from the United States when you consider if you're putting yourself in the position of a European Union or an India or even China trying to negotiate with the United States. You're saying, well, if the court system even inside the United States is unsure about whether or not these tariffs do have legal standing, well, then you probably don't have as much urgency to want to come to the negotiating table or at least want to ink a deal. So, A, it kind of takes away some of the teeth that the United States might have at the negotiating table, but then it also doesn't really give you any sort of urgency to want to move quick on this. First off, when it comes to most of these 10% tariffs, we have until basically the second week of July to figure this out. The European Union, as we know, that 50% tariff that the president had originally threatened also got pushed back to July 9th. So there's really kind of no urgency here, especially knowing that this appeals decision that was just handed down in the last hour or so means that it's going to take another few weeks to figure out exactly what happens with this. So again, it does change the dynamic slightly here.
Brian Cheung, thank you so much, as always, for your insights and analysis. Let's turn now to Timothy Brightbill. Thank you so much for being here. Let me just get your reaction to this latest appeals court decision that, at least temporarily for right now, basically reinstates President Trump's tariffs, right?
That's correct. This is a temporary administrative stay from the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. I think it's notable that it was signed by 11 of the judges, including the chief judge, and it allows for some rapid briefing of the issue over the next 10 days or so. So, yes, it's a temporary stay while they decide what to do next and allow the parties to brief as this issue continues to move forward.
And what do you anticipate is going to happen next? Are we basically seeing a slow-moving or maybe a fast-moving train until this all goes to the Supreme Court? Is that where this ends up?
Well, it's very hard to predict. Trade cases almost never go to the Supreme Court. But I think in this case, the issues are obviously significant enough and important enough that ultimately this will be decided by the Supreme Court. So hard to predict whether a stay will last, whether the tariffs will go in place or not. But at some point, the Supreme Court will weigh in.
And let's just talk for a moment about that ruling by the trade court, which basically temporarily blocked the Trump administration's tariffs. What did you make of that ruling and the implications and, frankly, the backlash that we saw from the White House?
Sure. Well, it's a very significant ruling last night from the U.S. Court of International Trade and a setback for the administration, and certainly another step in what has been a very fast-moving and convoluted trade war. It's the first court ruling setting aside this administration's continued use of tariffs on our trading partners. So very significant in that regard. And I think two things stood out to me, sort of two pillars from the decision. First, the court held that while the president has the power to regulate imports under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, that does not authorize worldwide retaliatory tariffs. And it doesn't authorize the president to impose whatever tariff rates he deems desirable. And then second, while the president declared a national emergency due to an unusual and extraordinary threat due to the fentanyl crisis, the court found that his remedy of tariffs did not address or deal with that threat and emergency. It only provided leverage or negotiations power, which is not what the law requires. So I think a very important decision from the Court of International Trade. Now it all gets reviewed again by the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, and ultimately, I do think, to the Supreme Court.
How do you assess the strength of the case that the Trump administration is making, that they do, in fact, have this emergency authority?
Well, it's interesting. The Court of International Trade is the same court that largely upheld President Trump's China tariffs and national security tariffs in the prior administration. So I think it's very significant that they ruled against the president on these broader tariffs. So we'll just have to see how the appeals court will proceed. And again, ultimately, I think the Supreme Court will have the final word on whether the president does have authority and whether the IEEPA law allows the use of tariffs Normally, it's used for sanctions, not for tariffs on dozens of countries.
You know, it's interesting. You heard Peter Navarro there at the top of the show say, look, even if we get blocked in the courts, there are other methods that we could use. We are not deterred by the courts trying to block us. What are those other avenues by which they could impose these tariffs? And if they're so confident in those, why not go that route in the first place?
Sure, the president might move ahead with other forms of tariffs. There are several other laws available. So you have Section 301, which was the basis for the China tariffs that are still in effect. You have Section 232, the national security law, which was used for steel and aluminum initially. And there are current investigations going on targeted toward lumber, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and other industries. So those laws could be used. And there are other laws, such as Section 122, where the president can respond to a balance of payments emergency with tariffs of up to 15%, but that's only for up to 150 days. So it's a real question whether the president will simply fight this appeal or pivot to one of these other laws as a way to impose tariffs.
You know, the president has argued that these tariffs are necessary to level the playing field, to get better trade deals. How do you see this whiplash that we're all watching in the courts impacting those negotiations that are ongoing?
Well, I agree that I think our trading partners would be wise to continue discussions and negotiations. So perhaps the court ruling perhaps limits leverage a little bit. But if I were the United Kingdom or the European Union, Japan, Korea, any of our trading partners, I would continue to negotiate. There are plenty of trade issues to address, plenty of trade barriers to remove if both sides are interested. So I would not use the court rulings as an excuse for stepping away from the negotiating table.
All right, Timothy Brightbill, thank you so much for all of that great information. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.